Today I'm going to go through topic 1.1 from the course and exam description for AP Environmental Science. This topic is called Introduction to Ecosystems. So make sure that you are paying attention to the learning goal or learning target. And so the first one that we're going to go through is to explain how we can define ecosystem boundaries. So for your assessment, your mastery check, your quiz, you will need to know this kind of information. And so let's go through it. We have a few definitions that are probably review for you from a regular biology class if you've had that already. And so you need to know what community college is, community ecology, not community college, but community ecology, which is the study of interactions among species, and how they interact, which is called symbiosis. And then we have boundaries for ecosystems, that is a certain temperature, salinity of water if it's an aquatic ecosystem, the soil, etc. So when we talk about an ecosystem, for example, where we live is a chaparral ecosystem. That's also a biome, but within chaparral we have oak woodland. That would be a particular ecosystem within a biome. So we can see by these diagrams here that an ecosystem can vary in size. So the first picture over here, we have Yellowstone National Park, which is Wyoming, a little bit of Montana, and a little bit of Idaho. And it's a really large ecosystem. And sometimes it's called the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But an ecosystem can also be a very small place, like on this tree and in this little hole of a tree where certain things live. My patio, where I grow my plants in big planters, is its own ecosystem. I have to pay attention to what the temperature is on the patio because it's hotter there in the morning than it is outside of my patio. I have to pay attention to all kinds of things, how the water is flowing as it rains, what kind of bugs are invading. So your patio or your yard can be its own ecosystem, or you can have a whole area or a town that can be an ecosystem. So there's big or small. So recall this term from biology class called the biosphere, but it's basically all the interconnected ecosystems on Earth. So now we have another learning target here. So LG means learning goal, or we can call them learning targets. And make sure you also know the definition of competition. So species compete for resources, food, for shelter, for water, for nutrients in the soil if you're a plant. And because of competition, we have something called competitive exclusion principles. So if you have two species competing for the same thing, they usually do not coexist for the exact same resource. There are also a couple of definitions about competition that you need to know, and you can see by the little graphic that intraspecific competition is competition within the same species, and interspecific competition is competition with two different species. So you can see these are two predators that are competing for a piece of meat. These are competing for water, and the giraffe and the bunnies are both competing for grass. We also have the definition of a niche. Now, a niche can be a lot of things, but it's the role or the position a species plays in an environment. What does it eat? What are its predators that eat it? What kind of habitat does it live in? How does it reproduce? And so there are a bunch of, each species can live in a high variety of temperature, or in the water salinity, or a range of climates or habitats, but they usually don't occupy all of everything they can. And so all of the roles or positions a species can occupy is called a fundamental niche, but because of competition we have a realized. And so in this diagram here, we can see there's two species of barnacle. Barnacles are actually little animals. They're kind of like crabs. They're related to crabs and they come out of their shells. and they eat plankton that swims by in the water. But if we look at this brown barnacle here, it could occupy the whole thing from high tide to low tide marks. But because it's in competition with Balaenas, this blue one, which are basically a little bit stronger, and the Balaenas can only occupy there. They can't be in drier temperatures. So when the tide goes out, these places up here at the high tide mark are only covered by water at the high tide point. And then when the water recedes because of the gravitational pull of the moon, they become exposed to air. Well, apparently Balaenas can't handle that because you can see by the arrows, its fundamental niche, it can't occupy it. And so it can only stay down in this area. But the brown ones can occupy a drier conditions for part of the day. And so because of competition, it remains in this area of the tidal zone. So without competition, you might have, these are species of, what do they look like? They look like some paramecium. And you can see that without competition, the carrying capacity might be 200 of them. For this species, without competition, the carrying capacity, which is another term from biology you have to know. So we have our growth curve, and where it levels out is our carrying capacity. And this one is about, it looks like maybe 140. But with competition, this species outcompetes, not quite, but almost outcompetes completely. But because of competition, its carrying capacity is only 150, whereas over here with competition, without competition, its carrying capacity is 200. So competition can lower a carrying capacity. And you can see that this species down here is really not competitive at all with another species. It doesn't do well. So when there is direct competition, a lot of times they partition the resources. For example, if here we have seed size, larger, smaller, and medium-sized seeds. And so these species 1 and species 2 can both eat medium, but they kind of stay away from the medium. So it looks like species 1 eats more of the medium and species 2 sticks to the larger ones, because fighting over resources takes energy. And that is not a good thing when you're constantly finding food and have to survive by getting food. You don't want to spend time fighting other species and competing with other species. That takes energy, calories, that then you're going to have to find food to feed yourself again. So species really don't want to compete all that much. So resource partitioning can be a behavior, or if you remember from biology, we have Darwin's theory of natural selection. And so over time, through small genetic mutations, you can actually have adaptations that lead you to different beak sizes, like here on the Galapagos finches. So they have different beak sizes that would eat different kinds of things. Okay, again, don't forget to pay attention to the learning goals or the learning targets. So we have some other terms again that are probably review for you. So predation is hunt, kill, eat. Parasitoid is a kind of a weird one. It's where a wasp lays eggs in something else, so it hatches it from the inside out. So that's kind of a weird parasite situation. And so we also need to know about prey, and predators and prey are constantly adapting through natural selection to either avoid being eaten or to get better at eating. And so sometimes we call it an evolutionary arms race. And then one other thing that you need to know about predation is that species can mimic defenses to avoid predation. For example, some species of snake that are not venomous, they will coil up and shake their tail like they're a rattlesnake. Even though they're not a rattlesnake and they're not venomous, they will pretend that they're venomous to try and scare away predators. Parasitism is another interaction. So parasites can kill you. However, it takes a little bit of time. So predation is hunt, kill, eat. Parasites, they want to feed on you as long as possible. So you can see there's a whole bunch of parasites that can be in humans in their intestinal systems. You get these if meat is infected and undercooked. You can get tapeworms and ascaris. They're not very common in the United States. We have a lot of meat inspection, but in other countries, if people travel to some other countries around the world, and because not all of them, but a few of them out there, and undercooked meats can carry these parasites. Now, they want to feed on you. They don't want to kill you, because if they kill you, they've lost their food source and then they die unless their eggs get spread out of you in some way. So parasites can kill you, and over time they might kill you. A lot of times they just live and feed off of you. Viruses are the same way too. Think of the common cold or COVID or the flu. They can kill you, but really they want to feed on your cells, and that's a parasite. And all living things can get parasites, not just humans. Okay, so make sure you understand the definition of a pathogen. So a virus, bacteria, some fungi, think of like athlete's foot that you could get on your feet is a fungi. Some protists like amoebas can make you sick. Malaria is a protist. And little worms that can make you sick too. Now, if there's a microorganism that can make you sick, it's called a pathogen. Now, a lot of times people hear the word bacteria or virus and they're like, they're so bad. Actually, let's talk about bacteria for a second. 99% of bacteria aren't pathogens. A lot of bacteria help us. For example, in our bodies, in our guts, we have a microbiome full of good bacteria that help us digest our food. And then there's all kinds of bacteria that are decomposers. So out in the forest, when leaves fall off the trees, they're decomposed and add nutrients to the soil. So there's a lot of really, really good bacteria, good fungus, beneficial microorganisms. But when one causes diseases, they're called pathogens. Here's another little term. Basically, when animals eat plants, it's called herbivory. And sometimes it can get out of hand. You can see this fence, and on one side of the fence you may have had deer that can completely eat a lot of the plant matter, and on the other side of the fence that they can't get to, you can see there's more plant matter and trees. So you also need to know about predator-prey interactions, and a predator-prey graph, we call it oscillating, which means that they go up and down together. And you can see first you have this frog and you have the toad that eats, sorry, that's a fly, and the frog that eats the fly. First the fly population grows, maybe there's a lot of food for that fly, and then the frog population eats a whole bunch of these flies and got like lots of nutrition, and they can lay a lot of eggs and make a lot of babies. Well, then if you have too many frogs that are born and eat too many flies, then the fly population crashes, and then there's not enough food for so the frog population crashes. So you need to know first that this graph is oscillating up and down. You need to know that it's a cause and effect. You also need to know that the prey is first, that increases or decreases, and follows by the predator. There are species interactions. We call these symbiosis. One type of symbiosis is called mutualism, and you can see examples here of mutualism. I'm going to tell you the clownfish and the sea anemone is a little bit debated. Some scientists think that they both benefit. Some think that the clownfish benefits and the sea anemone has nothing. But in this picture, it has where they both benefit. So for example, the clownfish benefits because it can hide in the stinging anemone and it doesn't get dung because it has a layer of mucus around its scales. And then it also fends off predators of the anemone. But that part's debatable. You have here pollination, so bees get nectar to turn into honey, and the flowers get pollinated. So the pollen from one flower is on the bee, and then the bee goes to another flower, and the pollen falls off, and that's how plants reproduce. And then there's other examples here, like, our gut bacteria is helpful for us to digest our food, and I talked about that earlier. And that's my dog barking. Okay, so you also need to understand the photosynthesis equation. We're going to come back to that in several places in Unit 1. But in coral reefs, we have symbiosis, mutualism between algae and coral. The algae photosynthesize. Coral is actually an animal, but it gets energy from the algae through photosynthesis. So that's another type of mutualism. Now, when one species interacts and the other, when two species interact, but one benefits and the other is unaffected, we have commensalism. And so there's, again, the debate with the clownfish and the sea anemone. Could be mutualism, it could be commensalism. Now, commensalism is where one doesn't have any good or any bad, and so we have that as 0. So you can see species 1 gets a benefit. Species 2, what 0 means is not a benefit, not harm. The other ones, negative means harm and harm. So competition, both are harmed because they use energy to compete. Predation, 1 gets food, 1 dies. That's a negative. And you can go down the list and make sure you understand in these interactions, all of these interactions, competition, predation, parasitism, herbivory, mutualism, and commensalism, in all these interactions, you need to know which one benefits and which one doesn't. Okay, so now let's have a little introduction to invasive species that we will get back to at another point. But if you evolve in a place and you've been there a really long time in an ecosystem and you've evolved and you have normal interactions of predator and prey, you are said to be a native species. If you don't belong in that place and you're brought in by humans or by the wind or some other phenomena, you're considered an alien or an exotic species. And humans can do this. Humans have brought in species on purpose and sometimes by accident. And when an exotic or alien species becomes a problem, it's called an invasive species. We'll learn a lot more about that later. And so here's an example of a mussel. We'll learn about quagga and other mussels that invade the Great Lakes and other lakes, even locally, that are invasive. And so here's some things that they try and do at national parks to prevent invasive species. And invasive species don't have to just be animals, they can also be plants. All right, that ends 1.1.